So one of the things when we first joined this call, you said to me was that, if you're worried about children and screens, but you don't want to panic, that phrase really resonated with me. And I think that's why I enjoyed your book Unlocked so much, because I am a primary school teacher, and I have some concerns about children and smartphones and social media. I have my own children, 8 and 10 years old, that increasingly are talking about phones, etc. And there are several campaigns getting a lot of traction at the moment, ironically
Mm.
on social media. At Westminster, there's the smartphone free childhood. There's the closed screens, open minds, which I think is more about trying to reduce the amount of ed tech in schools and education. And naturally, I find myself like agreeing with some of their points and nodding along. But then equally, I am kind of deeply skeptical about some of these really emotive, sweeping statements that some of these campaigners are kind of saying, where people are just taking it on face value. And I just want to share with the kind of listeners some of those claims. So, three that I heard recently: tech bros send their children to schools with blackboards. No ed tech at all, which I found. How do you know what every tech bro is doing and where they're sending their kids? Online homework should be abolished immediately because it negatively affects their sleep, which then contributes to poorer mental health. And then taking away children's phones will give them back their futures and their ability to concentrate. EdTech erodes learning. We have clinical studies that show this. We don't need more evidence, which I found interestingly an interesting stance. So, my question to you, with all of this noise out there, how can people like me, other parents, other teachers discern fact from fiction when it comes to what we're told about children and their use of technology and the harms it may or may not have?
It's a great question. It is a really difficult space because the other thing that happens when you get these very kind of clear-cut blanket statements is that when you try and push back against that, it immediately sets up this dichotomy. It's not kind of pro or anti-tech
Mm,
necessarily, but kind of pro or anti this particular position. And to say, actually the data are a little bit more complicated than if you just pick out this one study that shows this effect. It's really hard to push against that because what you end up having to do, what I found I end up having to do sometimes is like really doing a deep dive into that study to try and understand what they did and why and how. And most of the time, if not all the time, you find that, you know, the best case scenario is that it does show the thing that people are claiming it to show, but that still sits within a research area where lots of other studies show something completely different.
mm.
And actually, more often than not, there are quite serious sort of limitations of that particular study. So, it's never the case that this is not how science works, right? You don't do one definitive study that gives you the answer to something that you're interested in. Certainly not in kind of psychological space when you're sort of dealing with very kind of messy things in terms of the human mind. What we're looking for, and what we're not even looking for, is consensus. And there's
Mm.
been a big drive about this over the past year that if you ask a bunch of experts in this area, what do they think the data show? Do they all say the same thing? That must magically mean that that thing's true. That's not how consensus works either. What we're looking for is what we call convergent evidence. So we're looking for lots of different studies that all tackle this same particular topic, but they do it from different angles, they use different methodologies, they use different techniques. Each individual study will have real problems because there's no such thing as a perfect study.
Mhm.
But together, if you've got all of these studies that are all kind of saying the same thing and coming from different angles, you can be a bit more reassured that that thing is something that's a bit more believable. And that's where we're not at yet when it comes to
Okay.
understanding digital tech. We've got lots of different studies that do different things, that say different things. And we're not getting this kind of general direction, this general direction of travel. So yeah, it's very easy to pull out a paper and say this paper shows very clearly that something's bad. In the same way, it's easy to pull out a paper and say this paper shows how children get real benefits from this type of technology, whatever it is. And it's never useful to kind of just start sort of cherry picking and bean counting in
Mm.
that sense. I think if we can take a little bit of a step back from that very panicked medical emergency room feeling about this, then what starts happening is you start to see that there are lots of different possibilities for how we might address these sorts of issues. A big thing that we don't really talk about at the minute. We talk a lot about kind of bans and regulations in different spaces, but we don't talk about building digital literacy skills and media literacy skills, and increasingly what some people are calling algorithmic literacy skills. So, this idea that the evidence is in, we know that there are clear harms, we don't need more, very, very much lends itself to a kind of a preventative approach, especially when you kind of couple it with those sorts of comments around things like we need to give children their futures back, sort of digital free, and all of those sorts of things. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that whether you like it or not, digital technology is very deeply embedded and enmeshed in society now. Banking, IDs, literally just navigating around, and there's a lot of good use cases there. So my worry is that it's too simplistic to say, take phones away, give kids their childhood back, and then they'll be all right later on. It kind of feels like it's just punting the problem further down the line. And that's not me saying that I'm anti-ban or anything like that. I'm actually ambivalent about them, and I think they could be a really useful circuit breaker to kind of pause and have some of these conversations. But they need to come alongside thinking about how do we best prepare kids for a society that they're going to enter into as adults, where these are really crucial skills to have.
They tell me life is beautiful.